In a weed-choked scrapyard outside Pittsburgh sits a boxy little locomotive no one thinks twice about. Rusted, repainted, stripped of every marking. Just another yard goat pushing scrap. But beneath decades of grime, a builder's plate tells a very different story. One that begins not in Pennsylvania, but in the devastated rail networks of wartime France, where machines exactly like this one kept Allied troops and ammunition moving after D-Day. Of the hundreds shipped across the Atlantic, almost none survived. This one survived. And to understand why it matters, you have to understand the crisis that created it. By the summer of 1944, France's railways had become a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered concrete. 4 years of German occupation and Allied bombing had left nearly half of all major classification yards unusable. Bridges lay in ruins. Their spans collapsed into rivers. The Allied Strategic Bombing Survey counted 45% of French yards and nearly a third of key bridges out of service by July. What tracks remained were often single lines, patched together with scavenged rails and wooden ties, barely fit to carry a loaded train. Coal, once the lifeblood of European rail, had all but vanished. Sabotaged substations meant that electrified lines sat idle, their wires hanging limp. Steam locomotives, those iron giants of the old world, sat cold for want of fuel. Army fuel memos from the period show coal deliveries to the continent at a fraction, just 15% of their pre-war levels. With every mile the front advanced, the gap between supply depots and the fighting edge grew wider, and the old system simply could not keep up. The situation on the ground was just as strained. The French railway workforce had been hollowed out by forced labor drafts, casualties, and resistance. 1 in 5 railmen was gone. Those who remained worked double shifts, patching rails and clearing debris, but the scale of destruction dwarfed their efforts. In the chaos of liberation, even the simplest movement, getting rations from a port to a forward unit, could stall for days if a single yard choked with damaged cars. Every Allied division depended on the rails. 90% of Germany's coal, 3/4 of all freight, had once moved by train. Now, with armies pushing east, the Allies faced the same challenge: how to move men, ammunition, and fuel through a rail network that barely functioned. Delays rippled outward. A supply train stuck outside Le Mans meant hungry soldiers at the front, or artillery without shells. The entire advance teetered on the edge of a logistical standstill. The answer would not come from more manpower or more coal. It would come from a new kind of machine, one that could run on diesel fuel, start up cold, and work in the ruins. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps, confronted with the scale of the emergency, ordered hundreds of compact diesel-electric switchers. These were not glamorous engines. They were short, boxy, and utilitarian, designed for tight curves and battered yards. But their arrival would quietly transform the Allied supply chain. In the shadow of war, these humble locomotives became the pulse of the advance, threading through wreckage and chaos, keeping the armies moving when everything else had broken down. A 65-ton diesel-electric switcher at first glance looks almost anonymous. Just a squat box of steel, rivets, and faded paint. But every detail on these wartime machines tells a story. The U.S. Army's 65-ton class, built by companies like Whitcomb, General Electric, and Plymouth, was engineered for one purpose: to work where nothing else could. The design favored function over beauty. The hood, for example, came in 2 main types. Whitcomb's was a single-piece riveted shell with a rounded top and a haystack-style air filter bulging from one side. General Electric's hood used all welded panels and had a flatter, more angular look. Spotting the difference between rivets and welds became a kind of code for railroaders and Army inspectors alike. Beneath the hood, the switcher's heart was a diesel prime mover, 8 cylinders and 1,200 horsepower, designed to start up cold on a French morning with no coal, no water, and no warm-up time. The fuel tank was slung low, shaped like a boat hull, hugging the frame to keep the center of gravity down. Army shop drawings show how the tank's sloped profile and heavy brackets allowed it to survive hard knocks and shattered yards. The trucks, two-axle cast steel drop-side frames, were bolted directly to the main frame, ready to take on patched rails and temporary bridges. Every inch was built for quick repairs, easy access, and the ability to run on whatever track the engineers could salvage. Getting these 130,000-pound machines from American factories to the war in France was a logistical feat all its own. Each locomotive was mounted on a welded steel cradle, the outriggers lined up with the frame's lifting points. Special heavy-duty eyes allowed a 30-ton crane to lift the engine and its cradle as a single unit. Quartermaster memos describe how these cradles were bolted to the decks of Liberty ships, with timber shims wedged underneath to cushion the blow of North Atlantic storms. The Army's portmasters, working from War Shipping Administration manifests, had to account for every pound, every inch of deck space. A Liberty ship could carry a dozen switchers in its hold, each one listed as a heavy equipment entry, with builder and Army serial numbers inked on the manifest. Convoy records from late 1944 show these ships sailing from New York, Hampton Roads, and Baltimore, joining homeward escort groups bound first for the UK, then splitting off for French ports after D-Day. The crossing took 2 to 3 weeks. U-boat attacks still threatened every convoy, and the risk of loss was real. About 5% of ships did not make it. But most locomotives arrived intact, ready to be offloaded by Army port battalions at Cherbourg or Le Havre. Cradles were unbolted, and the switchers were rolled onto French rails, sometimes within hours of docking. For the men who loaded them, these locomotives were just another line on a shipping card. For the clerks who checked the manifests, another serial to be ticked off. But for the armies waiting on the far side of the Atlantic, these 65-ton switchers would become the unseen backbone of the advance, hauling rations, ammunition, and men through a landscape of wreckage. And for one survivor, the journey across the ocean was only the beginning of a much longer, stranger odyssey. In the rail yards of liberated France, the work never stopped. Switcher crews, mostly young American soldiers, started their shifts before sunrise. Their uniforms picked up streaks of oil and dust as they climbed into the cabs of 65-ton Whitcomb diesels. Orders came fast: assemble a string of ration cars for Chartres, move flatbeds stacked with Bailey Bridge sections, clear ammunition gondolas from the main line. Each job was urgent. Locomotives ran for 12 hours at a stretch, with only brief pauses for a meal or a quick refueling from a battered tanker. The yards themselves were patched together from what war had left behind. In Rouen and Le Mans, rails twisted by bombs were hammered back into shape, ties replaced with whatever timber could be found. Boxcars riddled with shrapnel sat beside new American rolling stock. French railwaymen, survivors of the occupation, watched as the Americans worked. The Whitcomb switcher, its Army number stenciled in white, became the heart of these makeshift operations. Its short wheelbase let it slip into tracks too tight for any surviving steam engine. Crews valued the diesel's cold start. No need for a fireman, just a turn of the switch and a cough of black smoke. Depot records from autumn 1944 show the relentless pace. Some switchers logged over 300 hours a month, twice what steam engines managed. Maintenance was constant and improvised. Traction motors were swapped out on the ballast, air filters cleaned with rags, fuel tanks patched with tar and canvas. Army mechanics, trained in crash courses back home, kept the locomotives moving with whatever parts they could salvage from wrecked equipment. Soldier testimonies recall the clang of couplers, shouted hand signals, and the constant watch for sabotage or stray mines hidden in the gravel. A typical day might begin with a 30-car troop train assembled in darkness, ready to roll as soon as the front called for reinforcements. By midday, the same switcher would be shuttling medical cars to a Red Cross siding, then dragging derailed boxcars off a bombed spur. Crews worked without glamour or recognition, but their labor kept the Allied advance supplied. In the chaos of war, the 65-ton diesel became more than a machine. It was a lifeline, bridging the front's turmoil and the rear's fragile order. Every general's plan, for fresh ammunition or food, depended on a switcher crew coaxing a battered locomotive through another impossible day. Period photographs show these engines caked in grime, their paint dulled by weather, still rolling. Chalked notes from homesick GIS, such as Kansas City, or Bust and Home by Christmas, decorate the steel. Decades later, when one such locomotive surfaced in an American scrapyard, its battered shell still held the memory of those days. It was a silent witness to the hidden labor that made victory possible. After the guns fell silent in Europe, the fate of thousands of wartime machines rested not in the hands of generals, but in the pages of surplus ledgers and auction lists. The U.S. Army diesel switchers, once the backbone of Allied supply lines, became numbers on inventory cards stacked in the offices of the War Assets Administration. Each locomotive was assigned a lot number, its history compressed into a brief description, such as 65-ton diesel-electric switcher, used, condition fair. Some were claimed by the French railways, their army serials painted over for civilian work. Others were left behind, cannibalized for parts, or quietly scrapped in the shadow of ruined yards. But a tiny fraction, perhaps only a few dozen, were tagged for return. Their journey home began with a maze of paperwork. Disposition boards reviewed each engine's service record, mechanical state, and transport cost. Only those deemed reusable or marketable made the cut. The rest were struck from the rolls. For the survivors, a new set of documents appeared: transfer orders, bills of lading, and shipping manifests, each stamped and initialed by clerks who never saw the machines themselves. One locomotive, later traced by its builder's plate and transportation corps number, appears in these records as Lot 41-23. Its Army serial, faded but legible, matches a Whitcomb 65-ton switcher, built in 1944 and shipped to Europe under contract TC 2391. The auction ledger lists it as part of a group of surplus engines repatriated in late 1946, bundled with spare parts and shipped eastbound from Le Havre to New York. The vessel's manifest, preserved in National Archives microfilm, describes the cargo in spare language, heavy equipment, diesel locomotive, serial 18572 Cradle C7. Once landed at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, these machines were inspected, fueled, and offered to American buyers. Industrial companies scoured the surplus lists for bargains. Steel City Metals, a Pittsburgh area scrap and recycling firm, submitted a winning bid of $850 for Lot 41-23. The invoice, dated March 1947, shows payment by certified check and a note that the locomotive was to be delivered ex-dock. Buyer arranges rail movement. The locomotive's new identity began with another round of paperwork, property transfer forms, a Pennsylvania industrial registration, and a hand-typed receipt for delivery to the Allegheny River Yard. Its Army markings were painted over, replaced with a stenciled company badge. The original builder's plate, battered but intact, remained bolted to the frame, a silent witness to its improbable journey. For decades, these records sat in file drawers or faded boxes, their significance overlooked. Only much later would a determined archivist, piecing together auction lists, shipping manifests, and industrial purchase orders, reconstruct the railcar's odyssey. Each stamp and signature became a clue, each serial number a thread tying the rusted switcher in a Pennsylvania scrapyard to the chaos and urgency of wartime France. The paper trail, once routine bureaucracy, now reads like a suspense novel, proof that the most ordinary-looking machines can carry the most extraordinary stories. Steel City Metals ran a busy yard on the banks of the Allegheny, where the clang of coupling irons and the hiss of compressed air never quite faded. In the years after the war, the Whitcomb switcher, its army numbers long since painted over, settled into a new rhythm among the heaps of scrap and battered gondolas. Crews called it Old Number 7, though nobody remembered why. The engine's cab filled with the smell of hot oil and welding smoke, and the seat cushions wore thin from decades of 12-hour shifts. Yard workers leaned on its reliability. It could shove a string of loaded flats up the grade to the shears, or nudge a derelict boxcar onto the scale track without complaint. Local records from the 1950s listed moving everything from bundled rebar to decommissioned streetcars, sometimes clocking more than 100 moves in a single week. One former brakeman, Joe Ruzicka, recalled that the old diesel never quit. She would start on a January morning when nothing else would. We called her the goat, small, stubborn, and always in the thick of it. Over time, the locomotive's past faded into rumor. For most, it was just another workhorse, part of the yard's daily grind. But for those who worked the night shift or wiped the grime from its builder's plate, there was a sense, hard to name, that this was no ordinary machine. Time and labor wore away at the Whitcomb switcher's story as surely as rust ate through its paint. Decades of daily use blurred its past. Layers of industrial gray and company stencils covered whatever markings the Army had left behind. The original serial numbers, once crisply stamped, faded under brush and weather. Maintenance logs grew thin, first kept in careful ledgers, then in grease-smudged notebooks, and finally not at all. By the late 1960s, even the oldest yardmen had forgotten the locomotive's origins. Company rosters from the era list only a generic yard engine with no hint of a military past. The builder's plate, still bolted to the frame, was hidden under a coat of black enamel. Each repaint, each repair, each missing record pushed the engine further from memory. Surplus ledgers and Army shipping manifests vanished into storage or were lost to office cleanouts. What remained was a battered shell, oil-stained, dented, and anonymous. The locomotive's true identity became a riddle, locked beneath layers of neglect, waiting for someone to notice the clues left behind. A chipped builder's plate, half hidden beneath layers of black enamel, finally offers the answer. The raised letters read, Whitcomb Locomotive Company, Serial 18572, 65-ton DES-1. A preservationist, flashlight in hand, gently wipes away grime to reveal the serial. Cross-referenced with the Army's Transportation Corps roster, that number matches TC-2391, a Whitcomb 65-ton switcher built in 1944, delivered to the 12th Armored Division as Allied forces pressed through France. Only 84 of these Whitcombs were produced for wartime service, and fewer than 10 are known to survive in any form. Discovery triggers a scramble. Archival production ledgers, shipping manifests, and faded rosters align. This unremarkable yard goat is a rare, direct link to the logistics that made victory possible. But the years have not been kind. Corrosion has eaten through the frame. Restoration shops estimate a full rebuild would cost between $100,000 and $300,000. Money few museums can raise for a machine with no famous battles, no celebrity engineer. The preservationist's voice is steady but urgent. Lose this Whitcomb, and a piece of the Allied rail miracle vanishes with it. One more silent witness erased before its story is understood. What looks like scrap is sometimes a sealed chapter of world history. As more wartime machines vanish each year, their silent stories risk being lost for good. This locomotive stands as a rare artifact, a time capsule of the Allied effort that reshaped Europe. Its survival reminds us, even the humblest relic can hold the keys to understanding how wars are truly won. What stories hide in plain sight near you?